So, um, if two people happen to survive the exact same car crash, at like 60 miles an hour, why does one person walk away and feel completely fine within a couple of weeks, while the other person's brain, like, literally convinces their body that they are still trapped inside that crashing car 10 years later?
Right. I mean, it is the ultimate puzzle of human psychology, honestly, and it's something the medical field has really struggled to explain for over a century.
Yeah. So today we are doing a deep dive into decoding trauma.
Definitely.
Because it's a word you hear everywhere right now, right? From clinical settings to, casual conversations about bad days.
Oh, absolutely.
But it is just profoundly misunderstood. So we're taking this massive stack of sources, neuroscience, psychiatric history, psychological research, and we're trying to cut through all that cultural noise.
Yeah, we really need to.
The mission for this deep dive is to look at the actual biology, the intense historical debates, and give you a clear, rigorous picture of how the human mind genuinely responds to harm.
And if we sort of connect this to the bigger picture, like why this actually matters to you as a listener, it's because how we define trauma determines who gets help.
Right.
It determines who gets believed, and honestly, how we build our entire society.
Yeah, that's so true.
I mean, from military disability benefits to like the way we treat a disruptive kid in a classroom, the definition of this one single word reshapes everything.
So I guess we have to start with that definition then. And surprisingly, this is where the biggest fight in psychiatry has been happening.
Oh, completely. It's a huge debate.
Like if you go back to that car crash example, the traditional medical view has always focused pretty much entirely on the event, the crash itself.
Yes. The objective severity of the event.
Right, because the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5, they have this thing called Criterion A for PTSD diagnosis.
Yeah.
And it basically demands that you must have experienced or witnessed actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence.
Exactly. It's a very strict event-based checklist. It essentially operates on the assumption that trauma is defined by how bad the external event was. But researchers like Bessel van der Kolk and psychiatrist Judith Herman, they have spent literally decades arguing that this approach is fundamentally flawed.
Because they're saying it's not about the event.
Right. They argue that trauma isn't the event itself. It is the lasting psychological and physiological response to the event.
Oh.
It's what happens inside the person after the fact.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. If I'm tracking this, it means the focus shouldn't be on the hammer hitting the glass.
Right.
It should be on the specific way the glass shatters. And, the fact that it stays shattered. The hammer is just the catalyst.
Yes, that is a perfect analogy. And that distinction explains the two people in the car crash.
Same hammer, different glass.
Exactly. One person's nervous system processes the shock, categorizes it as a past memory, and eventually returns to baseline. But the other person's nervous system becomes completely overwhelmed. It fails to process the event, and it just gets stuck in this perpetual state of threat. The crash is just what started it.
But wait, if we, divorce trauma from the severity of the event, doesn't that open a massive can of worms?
Well, yes and no.
Because our sources talk a lot about this split between big T trauma, like a literal war zone or a natural disaster, and little t trauma, like chronic childhood neglect or emotional abuse.
Right, the chronic stuff.
Yeah. And if we say little t trauma is just as valid, aren't we culturally equating a bad childhood with surviving a literal battlefield? Because honestly, that feels like a massive stretch.
I mean, it definitely sounds like a stretch until you actually look at the brain.
Really?
Yeah. Think about a child growing up with a deeply unpredictable, emotionally volatile caregiver.
Okay.
They're trapped in an environment where their source of survival is also their source of terror.
Oh, wow. That's a heavy way to put it.
It is. And sure, that doesn't involve a single cinematic, life-threatening explosion. But chronically, day after day, that child's nervous system is bathed in the exact same stress hormones as a soldier in combat.
Wait, really? The exact same hormones?
The exact same. And the downstream effects like dissociation, emotional dysregulation, chronic hypervigilance, they are functionally identical.
That is wild.
The nervous system doesn't rank danger by how it looks in a movie, It ranks danger by the perceived threat to survival.
And the medical community is finally acknowledging this,
Yeah.
right? Because looking at the sources, in 2018, The World Health Organization added complex PTSD to their diagnostic manual, the ICD-11.
Yes, and that was a monumental shift
I bet.
because CPTSD was specifically built to capture this prolonged, repeated harm. It officially moved the needle from defining trauma as an event so extreme it would break anyone to an experience that overwhelms a particular nervous system's capacity to process it.
Let's dig into that nervous system capacity, because I think most of you listening know the basics of the HPA axis and the classic fight-or-flight response.
Right, the standard stress response.
Yeah, but the sources highlight that trauma researchers are focusing heavily on two other responses that kind of completely upend the traditional model: freeze and fawn.
Yes. So fight or flight requires a subconscious belief that you can actually win or escape.
Right, that you have a chance.
Exactly. But what happens when the threat is inescapable? Like a child trapped in an abusive home or someone pinned down in an assault?
You can't fight, you can't run.
Right. So the nervous system resorts to its most primitive defense, which is freeze. The body literally shuts down, numbs out, and immobilizes.
Whoa, it's like a possum playing dead.
Exactly like that. It's the same biological mechanism as a mouse playing dead in the jaws of a cat. It's a deeply ingrained survival tactic.
Wow. And what about fawn? That's a term you see thrown around on social media a lot lately.
Yeah, fawn is appeasement behavior. It is the instinct to actively placate and cater to the abuser just to avoid violence.
So, like, trying to keep the peace to stay safe.
Yes. If you can keep the dangerous person happy, you survive. And we see this heavily in complex trauma.
Right.
And the thing is, it becomes a learned neurological pathway. So as an adult, that person might compulsively people-pleaser or be totally unable to set boundaries.
Because their brain still thinks they're in danger.
Exactly. Their brain fundamentally misinterprets saying no as a literal threat to their physical survival.
That is fascinating. But while the body is doing all this, freezing, fawning, flooding with cortisol, what is actually happening to human memory?
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, because trauma isn't just a physical reaction, right? It fundamentally breaks how we remember things.
It really does. So under extreme overwhelming threat, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for logical sequencing and narrative sense-making, it partially shuts down.
Okay.
But more critically, the hippocampus fails to do its job.
The hippocampus,
Yeah.
right.
Your hippocampus is basically your brain's internal clock and archivist. It's supposed to timestamp an event, package it into a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and then file it away in the past.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If the hippocampus goes offline during, say, an assault, does that mean trauma literally breaks our perception of time?
It absolutely does.
Is that why trauma feels like it's happening right now instead of in the past?
Yeah.
Because the brain never hits the save button on that file.
That is exactly what's fascinating here. It proves that trauma isn't just a bad memory. It's not just psychological.
Right.
It is a nervous system trapped in a state of ongoing danger. Because no, it doesn't hit save in a coherent way.
So how is it stored then?
Well, there was a landmark 1995 study by Bessel van der Kolk and Rita Fissler that demonstrated this perfectly.
Why?
They found that highly traumatic memories are not stored as a normal verbal narrative. They are stored as fragmented sensory data,
Wait, like what?
like a specific smell or a visual flash of a color, or just a sudden, unexplained spike in heart rate.
Oh, wow. Is that the mechanical explanation for a flashback then?
Yes, exactly.
Because if there's no timestamp, the brain literally doesn't know the event is over.
Precisely. When a survivor smells, say, a certain cologne that triggers those fragmented sensory files, the brain doesn't say, oh, I am remembering a bad thing from 10 years ago.
Right, it doesn't have that context.
The brain says the threat is happening right now in this room. The biological holding pattern is fully active.
Man. And staying in that holding pattern for years leaves a permanent footprint on the physical body.
A massive one.
Which brings us to the famous 1998 Adverse Childhood Experiences study, the ACE study by Felitti and Anda. They surveyed, what, over 17,000 adults?
Yep, over 17,000. They were looking for a link between childhood adversity and long-term health outcomes.
And they found a staggering dose-response relationship. The more categories of adversity a child faced, so things like emotional abuse, neglect, a parent with a substance use disorder, the higher their risk was decades later for severe physical diseases.
We are talking major increases.
Yeah, the sources say major increases in the risk of autoimmune disorders, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and heart disease.
Yes, all of the above.
Okay, hold on. I need to challenge this a bit because I think a lot of people listening might be skeptical.
Sure.
If someone has 4 ACEs, 4 categories of childhood trauma, you're saying their risk for physical heart disease goes up at age 50.
Yes, statistically it does.
But how does a bad psychological environment in childhood physically cause plaque in the arteries 3 decades later? I mean, that sounds like a massive leap.
It does sound impossible until you trace the cortisol.
The cortisol.
Yeah, if a child is constantly in a state of high alert, their HPA axis is constantly pumping out cortisol and adrenaline.
Because they're always stressed.
Right. And over years, that chronic flood of stress hormones causes systemic inflammation throughout the entire body.
Oh.
It disrupts immune system development, it changes how the body metabolizes sugar, and it literally causes physical wear and tear on the inner lining of the blood vessels.
Wow, okay, so it's actually corroding the plumbing, so to speak.
Exactly. So by the time they're 50, that chronic inflammatory state has literally physically damaged the heart. It's what we call allostatic load, the physiological cost of chronic stress.
Okay, so psychological trauma is an undeniable, measurable biological reality, which brings us to the history.
And it's a messy one.
Yeah, because if the biological footprint is this massive and undeniable, how on earth did the medical field ignore it for so long? The history in these sources is kind of wild. It's less of a medical evolution and more of a deeply political street fight.
Oh, it really is a history of active resistance by the medical establishment.
Right, because to find the first serious clinical accounts, you have to go all the way back to the 1880s with the French neurologist Pierre Janet. He first talked about traumatic memories becoming dissociated.
Yes. And then, in 1895, Sigmund Freud and Josef Breuer published studies on hysteria.
The famous one.
Right. They proposed what became known as the seduction theory, which was the idea that their adult patients' severe psychological symptoms were the direct result of actual childhood sexual abuse.
But Freud infamously walked it back, like he completely abandoned the theory just a few years later. Why did he do that?
Well, you have to look at the social dynamics of Victorian-era Vienna.
Okay.
Freud's patients were the daughters of the wealthy, powerful elite. To stick to the seduction theory meant accusing the patriarchs of high society of rampant systematic child abuse.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Freud couldn't stomach the professional and social suicide that would cause, so he just changed his story.
He just changed it.
He claimed his patients were just reporting internal, unconscious fantasies, not real memories of real abuse.
Wow. That's terrible.
Yeah.
And the psychoanalyst Jeffrey Masson wrote a pretty scathing critique of this in the 1980s, right?
He did.
He argued that Freud's cowardice basically delayed serious trauma research for decades. Because if the most famous psychiatrist in the world says victims are just making it up, why would the medical field bother to investigate?
Exactly. Masson argued it was a foundational betrayal of patients, and it set a terrible precedent.
Yeah.
For the next 80 years, the establishment's default setting was simply not to believe victims.
It seems like the history of trauma is actually just the history of who society decides to listen to.
Yeah.
Because it took literal mass casualties for psychiatry to change its mind.
Unfortunately, yes.
Like World War I generated tens of thousands of cases of shell shock,
Yeah.
soldiers freezing, going blind, becoming mute, despite having zero physical injuries.
Right. And then World War II brought combat fatigue.
But the establishment still largely viewed these men as having like pre-existing moral weakness or cowardice.
Yes, they blame the soldiers. The real breaking point, though, was the Vietnam War.
Right, because you had a massive cohort of veterans returning in the late 60s and 70s. And they were presenting with horrifying flashbacks, insomnia, explosive anger.
They had no official diagnosis. They were being told it was just their own maladjustment.
So how did PTSD actually get into the diagnostic manual?
Yeah.
Because our sources point out it wasn't some quiet scientific consensus in a laboratory. It was a literal political campaign.
Oh, it was fierce advocacy. Veteran groups allied with anti-war psychiatrists like James Chitan and Robert J. Lifton.
Okay.
They didn't just write papers. They held what they called rap groups. They gathered massive amounts of data, and they actively protested the American Psychiatric Association.
Boy.
They proved that this wasn't cowardice. It was a normal, delayed biological response to abnormal, horrific events.
Right.
They practically forced the APA to add post-traumatic stress disorder to the DSM-8 in 1980.
1980. It is mind-blowing that something so fundamental was only officially recognized a little over 40 years ago.
It really is.
But while the veterans were kicking down the door for combat trauma, The feminist movement was simultaneously pushing to expand that definition into the civilian world.
Right. And this brings us to psychiatrist Judith Herman.
Yes, trauma and recovery.
Exactly. In 1992, she published that landmark book. Herman was working with survivors of domestic violence, rape, and incest.
Right.
And she demonstrated unequivocally that the psychological profiles of combat veterans were completely identical to the profiles of women surviving violence in their own homes.
The medical field had historically just waved away as hysterical women.
Yes, exactly. Herman proved that the battlefield and the bedroom could produce the exact same shattered nervous system.
Wow.
And she formulated a 3-stage recovery model, establishing safety, remembrance, and mourning, and then reconnection. Her work was revolutionary because it truly democratized trauma.
But because it took an entire century for the medical field to finally listen to people, when the dam broke in the 80s and 90s, the pendulum swung violently in the other direction.
Oh, it really did.
Once trauma was legitimate, everyone went looking for it. Which brings us to one of the darkest chapters in psychological history, the memory wars of the 1990s.
Yeah, that is a massive cautionary tale about overcorrection.
Yeah.
In the 90s, a trend emerged in therapy where well-meaning clinicians believed that basically all psychological distress was rooted in entirely repressed, perfectly intact memories of childhood abuse.
Like hidden files on a computer.
Exactly. And they used hypnosis, guided imagery, and highly suggestive questioning to try and uncover these hidden traumas.
But human memory doesn't work like a locked safe waiting to be cracked. Our sources highlight the cognitive psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. She completely dismantled this idea.
She did. Loftus understood that memory is not a video camera recording objective reality.
Right.
Memory is constructive. Every time you recall a memory, your brain reconstructs it. It's actually more like a Wikipedia page.
A Wikipedia page.
Yeah, you can edit it, but critically, other people can edit it too.
Oh, wow.
Loftus ran a famous experiment called the Lost in the Mall study.
Right, I've heard of this.
She proved that by having a trusted authority figure repeatedly suggest a plausible but entirely fabricated event like being lost in a shopping mall as a child and having family members vaguely corroborate it,
Yeah.
a significant percentage of people would actually construct a false memory. They would genuinely remember details, emotions, and sensory data of an event that never even happened.
That is terrifying.
Yeah.
And the fallout from that era was catastrophic. You had the False Memory Syndrome Foundation forming in 1992, massive lawsuits, people going to prison, and families completely destroyed over recovered memories that turned out to be clinically implanted.
It was a disaster.
It proved that while traumatic memories are real, we cannot blindly accept that a memory recalled under suggestive hypnosis is literal historical fact.
Right, because it reinforces the science we discussed earlier. Traumatic memory is fragmented, it is messy.
Yeah.
Trying to force it into a pristine narrative using heavy suggestion is incredibly dangerous.
And that era also spawned a lot of cultural misconceptions we still deal with today, like the idea that time heals all wounds.
Oh, right.
The data actively disproves that. The National Vietnam Veterans Readjustment Study in 1988 found that 15% of male veterans still met the full diagnostic criteria for PTSD more than a decade after the war ended. Time alone doesn't reset an overwhelmed nervous system.
No, it really doesn't. But we also have to address the opposite misconception.
Which is?
The belief that a traumatic event breaks everyone.
Oh, right.
That is statistically false. Psychologist George Bonanno has done extensive research on survivors of 9/11 and severe bereavement.
Okay.
And his data consistently shows that the most common outcome following a potentially traumatic event is not PTSD, it is resilience.
Resilience is the norm.
Yes. The majority of people exposed to terrible things process it and maintain relatively stable psychological functioning.
So if you're listening to this and you've survived something awful, but you didn't develop PTSD, Bonanno's research is exactly why you shouldn't feel guilty or think you're like secretly repressing something.
Exactly.
Resilience is the human default. But that leads us to a huge modern debate.
Yes, it does.
Because if resilience is the norm, are we culturally watering down the word trauma right now?
Yeah.
Like if you go on social media, people call a bad date, an awkward work meeting, or a difficult breakup traumatic. If we label everyday discomfort as trauma, doesn't that actively harm the people who have genuine, disabling CPTSD?
Well, this is known as the diagnostic inflation debate, and it is highly contentious.
I can imagine.
Language shapes reality. If everything upsetting is labeled trauma, the word loses its clinical utility.
Right, it means nothing.
Right. It becomes much harder to triage resources, fund specialized treatments, and identify the people whose nervous systems are genuinely trapped in a biological threat response. We have to find a way to validate normal human distress without over-pathologizing it. Being sad or uncomfortable is just not the same as a ruptured hippocampus.
The stakes on getting that language right are incredibly high,
Yeah.
especially when we look at the newest frontiers of research,
Yeah.
because the science is now asking a much bigger question.
Yes.
Does trauma end with the individual, or does that biological shatter bleed into the next generation?
And this brings us to epigenetics. It is one of the most cutting-edge areas of the field right now.
It's wild stuff.
It is. Psychiatrist Rachel Yehuda conducted studies on Holocaust survivors and, crucially, their adult children.
Hmm.
She found that the offspring of survivors had altered cortisol regulation despite never having experienced the Holocaust themselves.
Wait, how is that mechanically possible? Does the trauma actually, mutate the parent's DNA?
No, it doesn't change the underlying DNA sequence.
Yeah.
Think of your DNA as a massive soundboard in a recording studio.
Okay.
Epigenetics refers to the chemical tags like methyl groups that act as the volume sliders.
Oh, I see.
They turn certain genes up and other genes down based on environmental factors.
Wow.
Yehuda's research suggests that the severe trauma of the parent might change those epigenetic volume sliders regarding the stress response, and those altered slider settings might be passed down to the child.
That is unbelievable.
Now, we must be careful. The exact mechanisms of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in humans are still heavily debated and being mapped out, but the implication is profound.
It totally reframes human behavior on a societal level.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the implications for public policy.
Oh, absolutely.
If you understand allostatic load and the nervous system, you stop looking at a kid throwing a desk in a classroom as simply a bad kid who needs punishment, right?
Right.
You start wondering if their nervous system is reacting to an invisible threat.
And that is the entire foundation of the trauma-informed care movement that is currently sweeping through school districts, hospitals, and the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
It changes the foundational question from what is wrong with you to what happened to you.
And when you scale that up, especially after living through a global pandemic, the concept of collective trauma becomes very real.
Very real.
How we handle refugee asylum laws, how we fund community health, how we structure our workplaces. It all hinges on whether we recognize when a population is operating under an unaddressed allostatic load.
Definitely. But, we've spent this entire time talking about trauma as a response to fear, a
Right.
response to something terrible being done to you or a threat to your own survival. But there is a final concept we really need to look at, one that is often overlooked.
Oh, where does the research go from here?
It goes towards something clinicians call moral injury.
Moral injury.
Yeah. What happens when the harm isn't external? What happens when you perpetrate, witness, or fail to prevent an act that profoundly violates your own deeply held moral compass?
Oh, so when the hammer that shatters the glass is actually your own hand.
Exactly. We see this in soldiers who make life or death decisions that go wrong, in healthcare workers during the pandemic forced to ration care, or even in everyday systemic failures.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The biological response of moral injury isn't rooted in fear or the amygdala's threat detection. It is rooted in profound guilt, shame, and a loss of trust in oneself or humanity.
Wow.
It leaves a distinct wound entirely separate from PTSD, and you cannot treat it by trying to calm the fight or flight response. It requires a completely different mechanism of healing focused on forgiveness and moral repair.
Moral injury, that is a heavy, completely paradigm-shifting thought to leave you with. If trauma is the shattering of the glass, figuring out how to pick up the pieces becomes a very different task depending on who swung the hammer. We'll leave you to mull that over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.